So, as I say, in addition to this being a lovely book and an entertaining one, there does seem to be some urgency to it. As reading your introduction, do you think the fine arts are in crisis in our culture today?
I think absolutely. The traditional fine arts have flatlined, and creative energy has moved into other areas. I say in the introduction that industrial design is flourishing, commercial architecture, animation, web design, but the traditional fine arts, I think, have become distant from the mainstream population. It's hard for people who live in urban centers with major museums and a lively art gallery scene to understand this, but art simply doesn't have any impact on most people except when it gets into the newspapers about an artwork being stolen or some other work being auctioned at a very, very high rate,
right.
or some work of sacrilege where some aspect of Catholic iconography usually is blasphemed in some way, and then it gets into the newspaper. So I'm very concerned that the visual culture of young people is primarily video games now, which have a very strange and distorted sense of space, as well as a kind of hyperkinetic quality that there's a kind of barrage of the eye, an assault of the eye, not only from video games, but from the constant video screens everywhere that are now even at eye level on airplanes. In the United States, we have them on the top of gas tanks as we're trying to fill our cars. In the shopping malls, people are using Twitter and going to the web where there's a kind of flashing, strobing, fragmented effect. So what I feel is that what's needed is for people to recover the ability to just stare at a very complex visual image.
Okay, you've said a lot. As this is the way you do this, and let me try and pick up on some of those things. First, 3 steps back. Just the terms, the words. I mean, sometimes it's difficult for me to grapple with the words fine arts or high arts, because what do we really mean by that? And it sounds like a value judgment, like this kind of art is somehow more impressive or takes more talent than creating a fine video game does. Well, so how do you determine those terms?
Well, the term fine arts actually, yes, it's not an entirely satisfactory term, but what it's meant is art that is non-utilitarian. In other words, works of painting and sculpture primarily that are intended for contemplation, as opposed, let's say, to furniture or a Persian rug or something that has some particular use. For example, a Chinese vase or a Greek amphora might have originally been used for something, but then it's been transformed by its current placement in a fine arts context where it's on a pedestal and we immediately contemplate it. So let me just give the example of painting. Painting was the prestige genre in the Western art tradition from the Renaissance up until really pop art. Okay? And from the pop art period on, there have been so many other opportunities. Other genres have opened up. Land art, which I have a chapter about in Glittering Images,
yes.
Or performance art is thriving still. I have a chapter about that. But I don't think that art itself is in a particularly fertile point right now. But everything changes. That's why my book ends with a celebration of George Lucas's last film in the Star Wars series, the Revenge of the Sith, which the grand finale of which I think is absolutely amazing, and is on such an emotional level and so ambitious in its visual effects that it puts the current fine arts to shame.
Slight correction. Some Persians think of Persian rugs as only something to contemplate. Do not walk on the rug. What you're doing, Jian? My father was, some rugs we're not allowed to walk, just look at. Just learn to see them, Camille Paglia. And this is something interesting that you say that actually captured my attention. You say in the book, we need to learn to see again. What do you mean by that?
What I'm saying is that you don't need to go to a museum in order to appreciate great art. That you can look at a reproduction in a book. You're never going to get the full effect, particularly in something like a Van Gogh painting, where the paint has been laid on so thickly that it has a kind of textured or sculptural quality and something tactile. You can't appreciate that unless you're in the museum. Or impossible to reproduce Jackson Pollock's great paintings that go for 20 feet. Okay, so that's why I tried to choose for my book a very small example of Jackson Jackson Pollock. But I'm saying that my book is based on Catholic breviaries, on collections of devotional images. That when we stare at a beautiful work of art alone, okay, and I'm saying it's like a solitary practice of contemplation, that there's a kind of serenity and tranquility that's coming from this new stability of the eye. You're training the eye to be stable. I feel that there's just this visual assault upon us today in the Western world.
Everything that we do is the opposite of a silent, solemn moment looking at a piece of right these days.
And children, I think, are particularly prone now to attention deficit disorder from the manic kind of editing of TV commercials and other entertainments. In the theaters, I mean, people are now accustomed to a kind of blockbuster mentality, a barrage of sensory effects coming from all these speakers. Actually, George Lucas was in the forefront of fitting theaters with this kind of a sound. So there's, in essence, it's almost like the late Rome, the period of the Colosseum. There's a great deal of like noise and bluster, but to be able to appreciate the finest effects of in art, you need to be alone, I think, with the image.
Although some of the same arguments have been made about broadcasting, and that long form interviews, for example, have no place anymore in an ADD world. And I'd like to think we've proven them wrong with this program, because that's what we do, and people seem to we've been successful at it. So we take a lot of pride in that. I understand that you give a talk that you talked a little bit about how you decided what pieces to include. You give a talk that touches on the works that you had to leave out of the book. Which piece was the hardest to leave out, or what did you leave out?
It's only in a few places on my book tour where there are museums that have facilities for it. Am I doing this show as I am in Toronto, and I'm showing a little over 30 of the many more images that I had to exclude. It's a very, very hard process. For example, in Break Blow Burn, in my poetry book, the latest edition of that has an essay called Final Cut, where I talk about how difficult it was to make those choices for the poetry book, and I give examples of the poems that didn't quite make it. I think of all the works I wish were in my book. I wish I had gotten Matisse into the book. There are so many wonderful choices from Matisse, and also fashion photography. I wanted to put in the book, but there just was no time. The book took 5 years as it was.
Yeah.
I tried to keep it as slim as I could in order to rebel against the coffee table art book syndrome. These big, heavy, unwieldy, ponderous, pompous things that people flip through once and then never look at again. So to keep it slim, it was very difficult. Right? So there are 29 chapters.
Although don't those books stay on the coffee table so that at least people keep referencing them?
Right. Well, they're there. But there are 29 chapters in my book. It crosses 3,000 years, all the way from an ancient Egyptian tomb painting. And I tried to choose representatives of each of the major styles in the history of art into very, very short chapters in a totally accessible and inviting prose. I'm trying to induce people to pick up an art book who have never done so, and perhaps not even thought about the art history since college.
You write that part of what inspired you to do this book was the animosity toward art you've heard on AM radio. What do people say about art on call-in radio shows?
I'm a great fan of American political chat radio, and I as a registered Democrat, I'm very regretful that liberals have never quite mastered the AM medium. Liberals are...
So you're right-wing radio, basically.
Yes,
you like that.
Liberals do very well on NPR or BBC, a much more mellow format. But this raucous kind of vaudevillian format of AM radio attracts... I consider it a populist style. So I listen to it a great deal. And I've been very dismayed over the last 20 years about the low opinion of artists being expressed by both hosts and callers, and also the tremendous disrespect for, let's say, abstract art, which is still regarded as a hoax or fraud by most mainstream Americans. That the reason why
a hoax.
Yes, and actually,
How
it's
so a hoax?
Still abstract art. People who are interested in the arts accept it. It's been around for 100 years or more. But
this is my 8-year-old could do that kind of attitude.
Precisely.
Right, yeah.
Now, the cause of this low opinion is those stupid controversies over sacrilege in art. I mean, there are all these third and fourth rate works like Andre Serrano's Piss Christ do not deserve their fame, and they have caused. And it's just they're cheap, gimmicky, silly gestures in an outmoded style. The great avant-garde period, which began in the late 18th century, is dead. It's over. So on the one hand, I'm criticizing the art world for still thinking that shock is meaningful, which it isn't. Okay, because now shock rewards you rather than gets you what it would have in the old days, which is ostracism and poverty and derision and so on.
Not a fan of Damien Hirst?
Please. Okay. I mean, that's a whole other subject. Right?
Okay.
So, but the point is, all right, I'm trying to reach conservatives. I'm trying to reach also homeschooling moms whose kids have no opportunity to be exposed to the arts. But also, liberal parents may not realize that what's called art class in school is essentially do-it-yourself. It's like John Deweyite. You're like children are unleashing their inner creativity. I think real art history should be taught at the primary school level. Kids should be exposed to major works of art and major artists very early on. So this book is a first step in that crusade, as well as to try to induce the Americans to support vastly increased arts funding. Right now, why should American taxpayers support the art and artists who are perceived as anti-American, nihilist, atheist, and who are constantly blaspheming taxpayers' values? So I'm saying to the conservatives, look, many of my choices of works are spiritual. In my chapter titles are spiritual, like mystic vision and resurrection and so on. I'm trying to induce them, like we proceed through the centuries, and by the time we get to abstraction, to Picasso, to Mondrian, to Pollock,
yes.
I hope that I'm now convinced, conservative non-believers.
Do you really think all those people
art.
who are listening to the Conservative Talk Radio are going to read your book?
Well, I've been on talk shows in the U.S. and homeschooling moms are calling in and are appreciating my trying to reach them, and and the ones who have called in certainly saying that they're intrigued.
Just as a sidebar, given your politics, does it ever get challenging for you to listen to Conservative Talk Radio around the clock?
Well, I have my own views. I feel that that there are no intellectuals left, because at least in North America, because a true intellectual is ready and willing to critique his or her own political positions and affiliation. What we have now essentially are partisan hacks who are totally silent. We are in desperate need of young culture critics who are willing to negotiate that terrain between these outmoded liberal versus conservative positions.
Are you an intellectual?
I certainly am, and I'm probably one of the last left, because of my refusal to admit that the terms left and right and liberal and conservative are universals. They are very recent formulations post-French Revolution that I don't think are adequate for the complexity of the world's problems today, and we need to get past them. And until people realize that, we're going to be left with the sterility of the current cultural landscape.
Okay, getting back to art, you said something there that I want to touch on. If it's in a crisis today, a fine art as you call it, a traditional fine art, how much of that is contemporary art's own fault?
Well, art evolves, and I think that technology has now completely overtaken the fine arts. This is my argument that from the Die Stil and the Bauhaus in the early 20th century, that the whole period of minimalism and the great skyscrapers of the period of Art Deco and then following World War II, that essentially industrial design has taken on the mantle of the fine arts. And that's why young people's primary aesthetic experiences, I say, are in fitting their iPhones, personalizing their handheld devices. But the young people have no attachment to the object. When the new version of the iPhone appears, the old object is discarded.
Yes.
They're continually moving on. So I think there's something wrong with this because there is no spiritual dimension to these objects. But right now, people get tremendous pleasure, out of industrial design innovations. Steve Jobs was in the forefront of this.
But then let me ask